Thank you for allowing an accountant into your conference. So this is a paper that I've been working on and off for a few years, but I'm at the moment reworking it quite substantially. So it's nice and useful for me to give this presentation. It is about IRI, the Istituto per la Ricostruzione Industriale, which is a huge. So I'll give you a bit of background on the paper and on IRI in particular. IRI is was a large state-owned enterprise. It was funded under the fascist regime, and then it was used for different things. We'll talk about this in a moment. This paper is part of a huge history of this large organization, which is now published, and it's 6 volumes long. So only that gives you the idea of the magnitude of this institute. What is IRI? IRI, as I said, funded during the fascist regime to recover, to make sure that the Italian banks recovered from the crisis of 1929, but then it became a permanent institute to basically act as an arm for industrial policy in Italy. More interestingly, it acted as a kind of a third way ante litteram, especially after the Second World War. The IRI Institute, the institute became the instrument through which the Marshall Plan funds were administered into Italy. It was owned, so the holding was owned by the state, but the subsidiaries and the sub-holdings operated on the market. And so in a very fragmented Italian society, right at the border between the East and the West, IRI operated in between a communist model and a capitalist model. Also, you have to think that Italy at that time had the largest, so in the immediate post-war period, it had the largest communist party outside Russia. So huge trade union, huge influence of radical left. The Vatican was present in Italy, so a very complex and fragmented society. Just to give you an idea of how big and relevant IRI was, it was privatized by Romano Prodi in 1992, but it was really the engine through which the Italian miracle happened. In one of the chapters of this 6-volume-long history, one of the historians from Bocconi says, if you want to understand how relevant this company was, think about being a tourist in the 50s and going to Italy. You would go either by boat or by flying there. If you came from the States, you would take a boat. That boat was a huge transatlantic, the Michelangelo. Michelangelo was built by Fincantieri, that was owned by IRI. If you flew with Alitalia, Alitalia was owned by IRI. Once you land, you go and hire a wonderful Alfa Romeo Duetto. Alfa Romeo was owned by IRI. Then you take the motorway that goes from Naples to Milan, the first and longest motorway built in Europe. That was built by Autostrade, that was owned by IRI. Then you get to the hotel in Milan, you make a phone call with SIP, and SIP was owned by IRI. Then you go downstairs, you buy a Milanese typical cake, the panettone, and it was made by Motta, and Motta was owned by IRI. So IRI, along with ENI and Enel, accounted for several points of Italian GDP. We're talking about not 2 or 3%. We're talking about these 3 state-owned companies managed something like in between 12 and 16% of Italian GDP in the 50s and 60s. Okay, so quite relevant case. Now, the theoretical motivation of the paper, this may be less interesting to some extent for ISSTI or for STS colleagues. But there is one part that is possibly interesting for you, which is the idea of understanding how inscriptions can be theorized in a way that not only reduce and standardize, but also reduce and augment the possibility of compromises and diversity. And how, in one of the versions of this paper in the past, we were talking about Latour's notion of society and societize, and how accounting is an instrument to build links amongst members of a society. I think that the paper now is moving in two different directions. One is for the accounting audience, re-articulating or redefining the notion of governmentality that Peter Miller and Rose started in 1991 by rethinking the notion of political rationality, as we will see in a second. So in Italy, there was a political rationality, but this political rationality was pretty empty, was pretty flexible, was open to that need for compromise that Italy had. And then another paper that we are now developing on this, which this presentation is about, is bringing ambiguity back into accounting and organization theory. So how do organizations work because of the presence of ambiguity, of a radical notion of ambiguity, which leads into mystery and religious notions and religious notions such as mystery. Now, what I want to do, if this video works, okay? So I want to show you a piece from a film by Sorrentino. I don't know if you know this Italian director. He won the Oscar a couple of years ago, maybe a bit longer ago, with The Great Beauty. But one of his greatest films is actually called Il Divo, The Divine. And it's about Giulio Andreotti, the most important Italian politician who basically ruled the country from 1940s until 1992, I would say. And I want to show this because quite a few important actors in the development of the budgeting and planning procedures at IRI were members of the Christian Democrats, Christian Democracy, the same party that Andreotti was part of, but also were convinced Catholics. And so we need to understand a bit what it means to be a Catholic in Italy interested into power. So let's see whether this video works. It has got subtitle, I hope, for the non-Italian speakers. Yeah, there is no sound, but you would not understand Italian. That's okay. So. Okay, would have been nice to have the sound as well, but never mind. So, couple of things which are interesting about this this monologue. The first thing, Sorrentino plays quite a lot with symmetry. So the entire scene is very symmetrical, and Andreotti always places his place in the middle. So you have two extremes, and in order to administer power and to reach a kind of compromise, I have to explore this middle space in between opposites, which is quite important for accounting too. Accounting is all about balance. It's all about being in the middle of extremes, expenses and revenues, assets and liabilities, and creating a space for interrogation in the center. The second thing is what he says when he refers to all of these people that he has been asked to be killed. So Aldo Moro, Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, all of those names that you saw there. All of these people in love with truth, they do not understand that truth is the end of the world, and this is why we had to kill them. So for them, not the search for truth, but for the Catholics, not the search for truth, but the persistence and presence of the mystery in the world is what is a possibility for having compromise. If you have truth, you know where you have to go, everything is aligned, and there is no space for compromise. It's only if you make mystery the core of the core organizing principle that you can actually have a space for compromise. The third thing that he does is also to play with the chiaroscuro and the black. I mean, you see how, by working on the Jesuits, I understood that actually in their Baroque architecture, they play a lot with the chiaroscuro to make you concentrate on the darkness, not on the visibility of things. So here they play with the absence, with the mysterious. Intrinsically and inevitably left invisible and absent. I'm also writing a manifesto for a religious sociology with Roger Friedland, and we also offer a kind of critique of Latour and a bit of his work he has done recently when he compares different modes of existence, religious versus scientific. So, for instance, in the notion of translation, if you remember the graph in Pandora, so he does acknowledge the jump, the leap, the mystery, the absence, but he doesn't do that much with it. So what happens instead if we consider the unknowability, the intrinsic unknowability of things as central in the way in which we organize our social computation? I think that this is exactly what they try to do at IRI. So these are four key characters in the history of IRI. Ezio Vanoni was Minister of Finance, who was the author of the first attempt to systematize planning at national level. Then Pasquale Saraceno was a manager of IRI, who was the responsible for budgeting and planning at IRI. Was a pupil of Gino Zappa, professor of accounting and business economics at Bocconi University, and Sergio Paronetto was another important top bureaucrat at IRI. Now, these three people, you see that there are a couple of interesting things about them. First of all, they were the authors of what is called the Camaldoli Code. So, towards the end of the war, the Vatican realizes that the fascist regime is going to collapse and start to prepare for the future. So, gathers all the Italian, or some of the most important Catholic Italian intellectuals in a monastery in Camaldoli, in Tuscany, and asks them to imagine what a society driven by Catholic principles could be. And amongst these people there were Aldo Moro, for instance, Alcide Gasperi, who then became president of the Italian Republic, and there were Ezio Vanoni, Pasquale Saraceno, and Sergio Borromeo. All of them from a small village in the north of Italy, Morpene. Not only that, but also Saraceno was married to Vanoni's sister. So that gives you a couple of ideas. First, it speaks to the idea of robust action that Paget has described for Italian Renaissance Florence. So a mix of family and social studies. But what did they do in this Camaldoli Code? So they came out with this idea that when you have to pursue profit or when you have to act in the world, you always do this in the interest of the common good, not in your own self-interest. So later on, Saraceno and Paronetto became top managers of IRI. The Americans come to Italy and tells the Italians, okay, we give you money now, but not only money, we also give you accounting and business knowledge in order to turn around the firms that IRI owns and sell them on the market. And in this transfer of money and knowledge, they also proposed an income statement, which is the income statement that nowadays we all use. And that begins with sales, then you've got cost of goods sold, operating profit, blah, 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 and then profit goes to shareholders. And the Italians at that time that were a bit smarter than the Italians that we've got today in government said, oh, that's interesting. So, but this is not an income statement. This is a political statement. It tells us that the most important institution in society is the shareholder, and you have a certain view of corporate capitalism that we do not particularly like. Because for us, the most important institution in society is not the shareholder, is the family and this community, right? So a long process of negotiation with the Americans started in order to devise a different way of accounting, or a different accounting system to plan and budget the activity of IRI and then ENI and Enel in Italy. And they came out with this idea of value added. So you've got the value added there that then is distributed to employees through salaries, banks through interest, state through income tax, shareholders through dividends, and the firm through retained earnings. Loss account here became a platform for a couple of things. The first is a huge instrument of mediation amongst different interests. So you've got the production of value there, and then you try to be balanced and equitable when you distribute that value generated by the firm through different stakeholders. If I ask you, is there anyone here who knows the etymology of the word rationality? No? No. Ratio, yeah? So ratio, so ratio from Latin ratio and then nality. Ratio in Latin doesn't mean reason. It means two things. It means proportion, a ratio, and account, which is symmetrical, okay? So in order to be rational in the Middle Ages or early modern times in Italy, you had to be proportioned. And this is why accounting is so important. And this is why accounting is so intrinsically linked to the Catholic ideology of being always proportionate and to operate in the interest of the common good, not in your own interest, which means that I have to maximize my self-interest and my utility. Exactly opposite to what rationality meant in late medieval, early modern times. And that idea of rationality is what governs the set of inscriptions that they generated in order to plan for the production and distribution of income. Also, a huge platform of mediation here, because how you generated your income became a matter of concern, not a fact. It became a matter of concern. So when we have to invest this huge amount of resources that we have, where do we invest them? Do we invest in nuclear? Do we invest them in infrastructure? Do we invest them in services? Do we invest them in the north, or do we invest them in the south? So if they had an American maximizing utility idea, all of these resources would have been invested where they would have produced the greatest return, which is in the north of Italy. But because they had this idea of balancing the economic and social development of the country, they invested them in the south in order to close the north-south divide. And this is why some of the oil and gas investments were done in Sicily, in Taranto, and so forth and so on. So an idea of economy and society that was based on this search for the common good without defining the common good. So you had something that was really ambiguous and mysterious, and you have a set of inscriptions that were coherent with this ambiguity and mysterious nature of the common good. It's not like you have got profit and you have to measure it. You've got something which is absolutely ambiguous and ineffable. You know, you cannot really touch it because it links to the mystery of God. You cannot really believe in truth because truth is the end of the world, and therefore you devise inscriptions which are coherent with this ambiguity and open to diversity rather than closing it down. And so this instrument of planning and budgeting became a means of social order and economic development in what at that time was really a fully, I would say, social democratic country that was Italy, 50s and 60s. The IRI then collapses in the 70s with the oil and gas crisis, and then privatized later on. This, of course, speaks to the talk that I gave here, I think 6 years ago now, where you know, another Catholic organization, the Jesuits, who were using double entry as we nowadays use big data and artificial intelligence. They were really crazy about this new invention, but they were not fooled by numbers. So if you look at a cash account and you look at what goes in and what goes out of that cash account, you would think that this representation tells you only what is in your account. So it would reduce the complexity of the order to an inscription that then would make the order manageable. But what instead they did to avoid being fooled by that reductionist attempt was to operate the cash box with two keys, one kept by the procurator, who was the spokesperson for financial matters, one kept by the rector, who was the spokesperson for everything that was not financial. So every time that these two people had to meet, you know, they had to, like the missiles, when you have to sell the missiles, these two people had to bring their two keys, meet, discuss what the rationale of a given transaction was, and make sure that that transaction was always debated not only from a financial matter, but also from a non-financial matter. So every financial transaction was always a non-financial transaction. So what they did was to count what is visible, to count the visible, to interrogate what was invisible and impossible to be reduced to a number. I know that in order to pursue God, I need cash. I know that in order to pursue knowledge, I need cash. But I know that if I try to reduce God, or if I try to reduce knowledge to cash, that is a big problem. Look at what is happening in the university. That is a big problem. The moment in which you try to reduce the universitas studiorum, to money, boom, we are in trouble. Okay? So they did this too well, and they devised accounting solutions in order to deal with the irreducible complexity and mystery of what counted as God, good, knowledge, or the unknown unknowns that they encountered when they went into missions. So what happened in IRI was the development of a similar approach at various levels. So from the nation state, which of course accounts for value in terms of value added, to the subsidiaries down to the value added per worker there, down to the value added per hour. So all of these inscriptions flowing up and down exactly in a kind of Laturian way, from the nation state to the smallest subsidiary operating under the IRI within the IRI group. So possible developments of this paper or these ideas. One is to try to understand what are the practices that allow a compromising mindset. So we, even in STS, in a sense, I would have said that for all of my career I've been a constructivist, but now I'm tired of that, okay? Because I think that a constructivist in the end ends in the very same place that a positivist starts from. You've got this reality which is socially constructed or constructed if you look at the second edition of Laboratory Life, but then it becomes as real as the table for a positivist. I have a PhD student who is now looking into accounting standards and how they deal with the uncertainty of the future. And she came and said, look, I want to understand how accounting constructs the future. And I said, no, please, not again. Not another one, not another study on how accounting constructs things. Tell me instead how the mystery affects accounting. How what we cannot even reduce to a definition to a constructed entity. What does that impossibility do for accounting and for accounting inscriptions? This paper is about that. This paper is about how the idea of mystery, the religious idea of mystery, I cannot even, in Jewish, you cannot even utter God because you reduce the immensity of God. And therefore, if you have an accounting system or a set of inscriptions in your language that deals with that impossibility, what would that inscription, how would that inscription look like? These are two examples that tell us that inscription would look very differently, and they would develop what has been defined as a multivocality in relation to inscriptions. And this links to that idea of political rationality and having a political rationality which is much more fluid compared to what Peter Miller said. And I think I would possibly stop here. But I want to tell you one thing, just to give you an idea of how these things are, the move towards the mystery and the negative. And so I now talk about negativism rather than positivism. So can we actually build a social theory which draws upon the absence of things rather than the presence of things? And I teach all of this stuff to program managers who work for the UK government, including those who have built the bridge here or who are building Queen Elizabeth II. And so at the end of these 2 days, I give them these ideas of how to organize reporting data visualizations for dealing with the unknown, for dealing with what is mysterious and ambiguous. And he came with this picture, and he said, I'm the program director of Queen Elizabeth II, but if you think that this is a worship, you do not understand what my job is about. This is not a worship. For me, it's much more useful to think about this artifact in negative terms rather than in positive terms. So, and he says, first of all, because this is multiple. It looks almost as if he had taken a course from Anne-Marie Moll. He said, this is a warship, this is an airport, because of course there are aircrafts landing there. This is a small village, because there are 1,200 people living there. You know, if this were a nuclear submarine, you would have two different programs, so the warship and the nuclear power station, one that lasts for 40 years and another one that lasts for 1,000 years. And he said, if this were the case, you know, I could do multi-criteria decision-making analysis and I would be fine. The problem is that this thing has the tendency to become what it was not. No one told me when I took this job that at one point in the long life of these programs, this warship would have become an instrument to keep Scotland in the United Kingdom. Why? Because the shipyards are in Fife. And that means 12,000 jobs, which means 100,000 votes. So at one point of the life of this thing, forget about the warship because this thing will never go to war. Forget about the aircrafts because the F-35 will never fly. Forget about the, you know, all these other things. It's about something that I could not even think of. So thinking in negative terms prepares me to deal with the uncertainty and radical uncertainty of these programs rather than thinking in positive terms. I always make this example. So if I ask you, what is this? What would you say?
Bottle of water?
A bottle of water. Ah. That was the answer I wanted to hear, okay? A bottle of water, okay? And so I account, you know, one bottle of water worth £1. But if I do this, right, and with the undergraduate students, normally I throw it at them. With you, I'm more respectful. This is no longer a bottle of water, it's a weapon. So this thing has got the tendency to become what it was not. And, you know, given that this is a talk about value and valuations, value has got the tendency to change all the time. And so how do we set up accounting systems that deal with the continuous ambiguity and mystery of value? I think that if we look back at history, and in particular the history of, I'm not religious, but I do love religious organizations. So if you look back at how certain organizations which were run by people who really believed in the mystery, so like certain Catholics of the 50s and the 60s in Italy, or the Jesuits of the early, late 16th and early 17th century, we can understand how you can deal with the mystery and volatility of value. I think I can, or maybe I just tell you one thing that I realized watching The Crown on Netflix. So there was the anointing ceremony of Queen Elizabeth II, the first that was televised. So it was the first that was shown on TV. And Prince Edward, who was in France, so after his abdication, was with his mates and friends. And one of the colleagues said, "Oh, that's so bad because they will put this veil on the Queen, and so the anointing will not be visible." And he said, "Oh, that's really annoying. Why don't they make it transparent?" And his response in The Crown is, who wants transparency when you can have the magic? I think that is fantastic. You know, numbers are all about magic, are all about things that we cannot see, are all about those gap in the chain of translation that we cannot explain, but we don't do anything with them. So my next 10 years will actually be on magic, witchcraft, and alchemy. Okay, so this is my future research agenda. So I'll stop here. Okay, thank you very much.